Well, thank you very much for having us. This is joint work with Elena Derby, Lucas Goodman, and Kathleen Mackey. And of course, nothing I say should be construed to represent the opinions of the Joint Committee on Taxation or the U.S. Department of the Treasury. Today, we're going to be talking about our work to try and understand how flows into and out of tax-preferred retirement savings vehicles looked during the onset of the COVID-19 recession, and then how these flows changed relative to those seen during the Great Recession. And finally, to what extent do we think that some of the retirement policies that were enacted, specifically those part of the CARES Act, might have affected these contributions and withdrawals? And to do that, we're going to look at a large sample of individual level tax filings. So I'll kind of emphasize this a couple times, but these are going to be primarily from information returns, 1099-Rs, W-2s, 5498s, and individuals don't need to have filed a tax return in order to be in our sample. So non-filers are in here too, in addition to filers. And the three kind of findings that I'll emphasize is first, contributions to things like IRAs and 401ks did not meaningfully change relative to trend at the onset of the Great Recession in 2020, of the COVID-19 pandemic in 2020, which is a kind of stark contrast from what we saw during the Great Recession, where contributions to these accounts really fell off in 2009 and 2010. And then we see kind of an asymmetric response, depending on the type of account, in terms of withdrawals. So for IRAs, we see that we think largely because of the required minimum distribution suspension in 2020, withdrawals from IRAs declined quite a bit for those that would have been subject to RMDs. And for employer-sponsored plans, we see withdrawals increase. But this is largely for those under 70, those that would have been subject to the partially suspended early withdrawal penalty. So if anyone has any feedback, particularly on that kind of question, that asymmetry, we're really interested to try and better understand that. So let me just give a high-level overview of the policy changes that we're going to look at. So as I mentioned, required minimum distribution rules were suspended in 2020. They were last suspended in 2009. These are rules that require retirees to draw down some fraction of their account balance after they reach age 72 as of 2020. And then the other was a newer policy, which is suspending the early withdrawal penalty. I mentioned it was a partial suspension because it only applied to coronavirus-related withdrawals, but that was defined pretty broadly. And the penalty was only suspended up to the first $100,000 in withdrawals. And I'll show you a picture in a little bit that's going to show some response right to that threshold. There were also policies related to spreading tax liability from withdrawals over a few years and being able to recontribute withdrawals, but we don't see much of a response to those policy changes. Okay, so the data we're going to use are very large. It's a 5% sample of all individuals in the tax population from 2003 to 2020. We think that this is representative of the resident population in the United States in each of those years. And you can enter the panel by being born, immigrating, and you can exit by dying or emigrating. And again, this includes non-filers, so folks were not required to file anything on their own behalf. If a third party issued a 1099 or a W-2, you would be in the data. And there's a lot of research now at this point that finds that the tax filing population is around 99% of the census resident population. So we're getting almost everyone in these data. The fields we're going to look at are primarily from information returns. So retirement contributions to employer plans that are found on W-2s, defined contribution plans, and then also contributions to IRAs found on Form 5498. And then we're also going to look at withdrawals from retirement savings. Those are going to be primarily on the 1099-R, but we'll also look at some things for filers on the 1040, and then demographic information from the Social Security Administration's DM1 file. So this panel at this point has been used in quite a bit of JCT's internal policy work, in addition to a number of prior external facing academic papers. And so we're pretty comfortable with them. And as you'll see, as I'm going to walk through a number of pictures that kind of look like this, there's enough data here to create really smooth distributions, even when you're looking at relatively narrow bins. So this picture is showing average contributions to IRAs or employer-sponsored plans. And we're showing this separately for individual age groups, so single-year age bins, and then separately for 2008, 2009, and 2010. And this is the average, but it's including zeros. Okay, so when it says that around 50-year-olds in 2009 had about $2,000 of contributions, that's including folks that did not make any contributions at all. So the takeaway here is that during the Great Recession, at the onset of the Great Recession, contributions really fell off, and they fell off in a way that was kind of consistent across the age distribution. When we look at the 2018, 2019, 2020 period, 2020 is the last year we currently have tax data available. You can see that 2020 relative to 2019 just looked like another growth year relative to 2018. And if I had put 2017 in here, it would sit just below 2018. So it was really kind of just a steady increase, and you wouldn't know from looking at contributions that anything had really happened to the macroeconomy. Withdrawals paint a kind of more interesting picture. So these are withdrawals from IRAs, again, looking at 2008, 2009, and 2010. And again, this is the average level of withdrawals, including zeros. And you can see the really stark effect in 2009, the dashed green line there, of the suspension of RMD. So I've highlighted with vertical lines on the left, the age at which the early withdrawal penalty no longer applies, 59.5. And then the vertical line on the right is the age at that time, 70.5, when required minimum distributions begin. And so you can see relative to 2008 and 2010 that the RMD suspension really reduced withdrawals during the Great Recession. And when we make an analogous picture for the onset of the COVID era, you see a very similar pattern where primarily for RMD age individuals, their withdrawals fell off. I'll just kind of highlight here that we don't see any response in IRAs to the early withdrawal suspension. You can see those lines for 18, 19, and 20 kind of lie on top of each other. And a slightly different way to show the RMD suspension effect is to kind of take 2019, create a histogram where we're looking at their withdrawals for IRA holders as a percentage of their account balances. And so you can see that in 2019, the blue dots, there's a big jump right at the RMD amount, which for 75-year-olds, as I'm displaying here, was 4.37%. We have around 450,000 taxpayers that located right at their RMD. And then in 2020, we see, people still responded as if the RMD was in place, but they reduced quite a bit. And if you look over on the towards zero side, the number that took no distribution jumped up quite a bit. So this is pretty strong evidence. And if I showed the same set of graphs for 2008 and 2009, they'd look very similar. Okay, so moving to employer plans, we see a pretty different pattern. So first of all, this is, again, showing average withdrawals from employer plans. Here, the 1099-R does not separately delineate defined contribution, defined benefit plans. And in the data I'm using, I don't have those two pulled apart. So we're going to expect kind of a muted response because there's DBs in here as well. But you can see that during the Great Recession, people didn't really increase their withdrawals that were under age 60, and they didn't really seem to respond to the RMD suspension. And in the COVID era, we see a different pattern. So, we still don't see a response to the RMD suspension, but we see this noticeable increase for those under 60 in the average level of withdrawal. So we really think there's a response here that is to that suspension of the early withdrawal penalty. And when we go and try and pull apart, okay, who do we think is responding? One thing that we found was that we think that it's primarily people taking really large distributions. So here I'm displaying, I've put withdrawal amounts in $1,000 wide bins, and I'm showing the area near 100,000, which remember is that kink point where the penalty applied up to or was suspended for withdrawals up to 100,000, but not in excess of 100,000. And you can see that in 2019, there is a little tick upward in the distribution, kind of round number bunching, probably near 100,000. But in 2020, and the vertical axis here is the total amount of withdrawals, we see around $17 billion in withdrawals just among people who are taking $100,000 withdrawals from their accounts. So we view this as a pretty strong response, and something that, along with the puzzle I mentioned earlier about the asymmetry between IRAs and DC, something that we're still trying to understand better and learn more about. So if anybody has any ideas about what these taxpayers are doing and what their motivations might be to take all this money out, when maybe you might think if the market's low, you might have wanted to do a Roth conversion or something else, as opposed to actually taking the money out. And we strip Roth conversions out here. So just to recap, we see that contributions, these flows into the retirement savings vehicles, pretty much increases if this was another normal year, unlike the Great Recession. And then we see this kind of puzzle, right? We see that IRAs seem to respond to the RMD suspension, but not the early withdrawal penalty suspension. And then we see that employer plans responded to the early withdrawal penalty suspension, but not the RMD suspension. And so we're trying to learn more about that. And we're also trying to learn more about what we think is going on in terms of bunching at those really large withdrawal levels.